I recently played Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach. It isn't the type of game that I would typically find much interest in, but there was something in the art style that captured my attention immediately. Equally important to my experience with the game was how I was able to connect what the game was doing to different art movements and some pretty bleak philosophy. In a lot of ways, this video is more about those things than the game itself, but this game ended up doing some weird stuff to my mind, even if it was mostly unintentional, or if it ultimately says more about my own mixed up brain chemistry than the game itself. But yeah, this game led me into a real existential crisis informed by a few ideas that I've been noticing in the background and several other places in entertainment. If you've watched any of my videos before, you may have noticed that I tend to gravitate towards games that have unique art styles. As computational power gets us closer and closer to photorealism and pulling us out of the depths of the uncanny valley, it is easy to be swept up with things like resolution, ray tracing, and even cloth physics. But if I'm being completely honest, those things rarely stand out to me. I don't play video games in order to escape into worlds that are becoming increasingly indistinguishable from our own. Realism can be novel when done well, but I don't really care about things like fidelity, and I'm certainly not interested when it gets to the degree of something like The Last of Us Part 2's appreciation for things like viscera and pained facial expressions. I guess I just don't need to hear an enemy dying from a sucking chest wound in order to feel immersed. I tend to seek out things that skew in the opposite direction of the uncanny valley. I want to see things that couldn't possibly exist in our world, or at the very least, things that flip the mundane in new and interesting ways. When I think of games that have striking visual styles, some strange things come to mind. There's a relatively obscure one called Windowsill that's never too far away from my mind since I played it. There's something so calm and so alien about that experience. Things feel cold and there's this creeping sense of paranoia, but it is coupled with this beautifully playful attitude. And the way that lighting plays off of everything really sells a mood that is simultaneously serene with this underlying sense of uneasy quietness. I love art styles like this. For me, it really is the simple things that do the most damage. Simple things like the way that shadows work in Thomas Was Alone, the interplay of foreground and background like something found in Inside, the drowsy melancholy of Glitch Hikers, all the way down to the thick cicada-laden atmosphere of Sendai in Persona 5 Strikers. With our world becoming more and more interconnected by the day and the constant deluge of bad news blitzing us from every app and social media platform, I have found it more and more important to escape into places that only mirror our own world in the most superficial of ways. And I've always been this way, to be honest. I've always had an appreciation for the surreal, the low budget, and creative ways of escaping the mundane. I love the projected skies and poorly green-screened backgrounds of something like the mighty Boosh.
Dixon Bainbridge?
Hello, ma Bainbridge? It's Bobby Bob.
I'm busy, Fossil. Is there a problem with the sale at the zoo?
I love movies that are super saturated with color like The Fall, or the way that darkness is captured in a movie like Nope. And I even have a great deal of affection for that weird fever dream quality that certain Disneyland attractions contain. I guess this is a long-winded way of saying what I truly appreciate is authored space. I think it takes a lot of courage and creativity to step outside of the established and trust in your own vision, and as a result, these art styles always have had a profound impact on me. But this penchant for the weird doesn't always just lead me to the fun and quirky things. Sometimes it can pull me into more bizarre and uncomfortable aesthetics. Anyone familiar with the aesthetic-heavy side of the internet has long since heard of, and probably even tired of, the vaporwave movement. Classical art styles such as Roman Greco bust played against neon backgrounds and checkerboard tiling, Japanese characters usually shot out of a bad Google translation, indoor pools, palm trees, and Windows 95 dialog boxes. This stuff was everywhere for a minute there, and the aesthetic continues to inspire and mutate as time goes on. Vaporwave begat synthwave, which is as much a musical genre as it is an artistic movement, and this one in particular maintains its influence to this day with things like Ready Player One and, more importantly, Stranger Things. But like all movements, derivative works follow and grow into subgenres till you are left with things like synth metal, labor wave, and most bizarrely, Trump wave.
Hey, Donald. Oh, you look great. Thank you very much. I'm Donald owns this restaurant.
Yeah, fuck. Look, man, people on the internet will do just about anything for likes. But with all these art styles more or less being born on message boards and social media platforms, there is a real transient quality to all of this. Artists will post something just to catch attention for a moment, and then the next day there will be another post until the original work is buried. Sure, the most ubiquitous contributions will come to define each little movement, but Google things like Vaporwave or Synthwave and you will be beat down with thousands and thousands of images. Most of the work being done seems to exist just as a way to capture a vibe and then earn likes or karma depending on where it was posted. But the sheer amount of artwork being produced means that there is a real disconnect between the people creating it and the people reposting it and archiving it or just viewing it. This leads to a real sense of otherworldliness and anonymity in the aesthetic side of the internet, and with that, a sense of alienation. And this alienation and otherworldliness is felt nowhere more than the movement of capturing liminal space. Maybe you've seen some of these images before, or more importantly, maybe you feel like you've seen these images before. The whole point of this movement is capturing spaces that you've moved through without noticing. Little stills from the recesses of your memory, or spaces that seem to assemble in the garbled up mess that inform the settings of our dreams. I remember the first image I saw from this subgenre vividly. It was this one. I'll discuss how it really resonated with me in a bit, but something fired off when I saw this image. I could have sworn I had been to this place before, or maybe I'd just played in that space in a dream, or maybe I had seen it in a movie. But deep down, I knew none of those were true. Sure, I had grown up in tract housing before on Air Force bases. Sure, I had weird dreams. Sure, Edward Scissorhands had featured these overly manicured and pastel-colored suburbs. But I hadn't been to this place. And I knew that. But I felt this place. I then began to crawl the internet, and I became obsessed with these images. These spaces that were meant for people to inhabit that were suddenly robbed of their purpose. The lack of people in them and the absence of activity fired off this simultaneous mix of wonder, dread, and loneliness. And it was so bizarre because in a lot of cases, these are just mundane things like hallways being captured. But then March 2020 came. And then suddenly so much of our geography, at least here in Los Angeles County, became one big liminal space. Everything emptied out. Everyone was inside, the streets were dead, plazas barren, and parks abandoned. I remember one night in particular. I had hit this moment where I just could not be inside anymore. I had been taking the virus very seriously, as my mother was ill before the pandemic had started, and she was only breathing with the assistance of a ventilator. So I couldn't risk going over to see her and potentially infecting her as my job had stayed open throughout the shutdown. She would eventually pass in August of 2020, but luckily it was from her own pre-existing condition, so I was spared the grief of being the one who got her sick. I miss you, Mom. But back to that night where I couldn't take it anymore, I left the house with my cat and hung out in a completely empty movie theater plaza. There was something both calming and horrifying about being there devoid of all activity. The whole scene had this real ended days feeling, and I just couldn't shake it. But even as the restrictions lifted and the world started to move into something that sort of resembled normal, I couldn't turn off that part of my brain that had started noticing these liminal spaces. This might be a weird way of looking at the world, but I think it tracks with how my mind seems to be wired. When I was young, I took up skateboarding, and while I was never the best, I was competent. And so it morphed the way that I looked at the world. Things that used to just exist in the background and spaces that were once contextualized for one thing suddenly became skate spots. Staircases, banks, washes, you name it, they all became obstacles. When I got my license and started to drive, I would throw my board into the trunk of my car and I would cruise around at night just looking around, hopping fences or cruising down alleys in hopes of finding the next untouched piece of architecture that could become the next secret skate spot. It's a funny thing really how skaters recontextualize their environments. In some cases, there are staircases or handrails that are just as famous as some professional skateboarders. As I got older, I started making friends with all sorts of people, some of which I met through skateboarding, some of which I met through school, but I eventually found myself hanging out with people who did graffiti. And that art form brought out the same sort of mind virus. Suddenly, I found myself in abandoned buildings and train yards tagging along with people that were far more artistically inclined than myself. Things like overpasses, things like billboards, things like train yards, they all became places for art to happen, and they suddenly had a new meaning in the new context. I have inadvertently spent decades rewiring my brain to recontextualize space. It's probably a useless skill, but I did it, so there's really no going back now. So between seeing these pictures on the internet and all of a sudden seeing liminal spaces pop up all over the place, I did what I always do, which is get my hands dirty. So I started taking these weird liminal photos for myself. I've grown to love this hobby, and the night crawling aspect truly is the biggest draw. Being outside in places that I'm not meant to see at a time where most normal people are sleeping, that's really what all of these hobbies I've collected have been about. I'm not much of a photographer. I don't know much about composition. I can't tell you the best way to light up a spot, but what I can tell you is that it is a fun thing to do for the sake of doing it, and being outside at a time where I'm not supposed to is the real high. So if you're interested in looking at these weird liminal space photos that I've taken, you can find them on Instagram at Visual Hauntology. And that takes me to the major piece of philosophy that I have to discuss before I can dive properly into how these ideas affected my enjoyment of Security Breach, and that is the concept of hauntology. Both my YouTube channel and now my Instagram page are named after this idea, and it's an idea that's really stuck with me ever since I became aware of the concept. I was first introduced to this concept through an episode of Chapo Trap House where they did a reading series on Mark Fisher. Mark Fisher was a critic, an author, and a philosopher, and while he coined many and otherwise popularized many ideas, the one that stood out to me more than anything was this idea of hauntology. Any explanation that I would give of the concept would certainly butcher it and potentially risk missing the point, so I do suggest this video called Mark Fisher, the Slow Cancellation of the Future.
What is the bad news that you already know? Well, that the future has disappeared.
I've linked it and another of Mark's videos below. But at its core, hauntology is the concept of our cultural past haunting us as if it were a ghost. Ideas that we cannot get past, and in Fisher's explanation, the cancellation of our own future by holding on to things from the past for profit. If we look at things like the movie industry, it doesn't take long to see how ubiquitous the remake or reboot has become, especially in the cases of Star Wars or Spider-Man. Year after year, the box office seems to suffer from the same case of cultural deja vu, and this is not a mistake. Hollywood is a business, and as a result, they have to seek a return on investment. And with that in mind, it becomes more and more tempting to look back instead of looking forward to reinvent. I'm not saying anything special here. We've all noticed this pattern, but I couldn't help especially feel it when the plot of Star Wars Force Awakens followed the almost identical plot progression to the original 1976 film, complete with the destruction of yet another Death Star. Really what has happened is that capitalism has halted our future in exchange for repackaging our past. And where things get really heady is when you see teenagers today holding on to things like Stranger Things when they were born over 2 decades removed from the time period in the show. My generation had that 70s show though, so this kind of thing has been happening. We are culturally in a loop, where new ideas are rare and we spend more time admiring the past instead of looking forward. It is especially bleak in the case of science fiction. Not too long ago, things like Lost in Space or The Jetsons, Futurama, or Star Trek looked forward to our future as a realm of possibility, a time where the problems of the day could be fixed and even the most unskilled person could see and do things that we could never imagine today. But today, it's hard to find a science fiction story that isn't severely dystopian or post-apocalyptic. Where we used to look forward to things like flying cars, jetpacks, and universal healthcare, we just now look forward to the impending doom of climate change, further alienation from our labor, inflation, and the rise of proto-fascist leaders all over the world. This isn't to say that we're all doomed, but things have been looking a little rough for a while now, and once our society has given up on new ideas, we are just doomed to repeat the mistakes of our past. So how does Security Breach, a video game made presumably for children, factor into both the concept of liminal space and hauntology? Really simply, actually. First, look at these environments. Security Breach takes place in an environment that is somewhere between a John's Incredible Pizza and a shopping mall. The game takes place in the Pizzaplex, which is the culmination of all the money that the Freddy Fazbear Company has made. I don't imagine that I have to do a full explanation of this game's setup, so I'll keep it brief. The original Five Nights at Freddy's came out in 2014 to worldwide acclaim and success. It was a horror game where you use cameras to keep the protagonist safe in his security room as Chuck E. Cheese-inspired animatronics roam the halls ready to kill you for plot reasons. This plot evolved over the last 8 years to birth multiple sequels, a book series, and a whole cottage industry of fan theories, as the plot has always been left intentionally opaque. In a lot of ways, the decryptomania that surrounds the plot is just as, if not more intriguing than the games themselves. But in the near decade since the initial release, Five Nights at Freddy's has become a mega brand, much larger than Scott Cawthon himself, the original creator, can control, to the point where we now have a full studio making games for the IP under his blessing. I really don't need to say more about Five Nights at Freddy's outside of Security Breach. I've messed around with some of the earlier games, but considering how big of a multimedia machine this property has birthed, I feel like spending too much time on a primer of the series risks that essay writing cliche of since the beginning of time. Security Breach is the most ambitious title in this series so far. It is a survival horror game that uses exploration and set pieces to open up more and more of the Pizzaplex until you have full reign of the facility, all the while avoiding the threat of an angry security guard, Segway-inspired security bots, and of course, the series' specialty, animatronics. But it is this facility that is really what makes this game stand out more than any other title in the series. First and foremost, this series has never seen exploration on this scale, with all the other games up until Sister Location taking place in a single room. But now we have the Pizzaplex and its consumerist sprawl. Inside, we find things like food courts, mini golf courses, a full bowling alley, arcades, a massive soundstage, and laser tag. All things that a 10-year-old version of myself would have just lost his shit over. The game is decked out in a sort of glam rock inspired version of 80s decor, complete with those crazy carpet patterns that you would find in suburban bowling alleys or skate rinks. Everything is neon and is glossy, and everything is larger than life. The whole building is equal parts theme park, mall, and birthday destination. And it's neat. But it does a few things that caught my attention immediately. First, it truly captures that sense of wonder that is inherent to going to some of these larger than life attractions as a kid. I distinctly remember my first trips to things like Chuck E. Cheese and later at Dave & Buster's. Both places seemed impossible in my prepubescent mind. They were spaces of infinite possibility, going from seeing the animatronics of Chuck E. Cheese and then running off into a labyrinth of plastic tubes and ball pits, only to be dumped out in front of ticket games like skee ball, and then row after row of arcade games. The space seemed to stretch on forever. And the same could be said about Dave & Buster's. Somehow these places seemed to have a magical quality back then where almost anything seemed like it could happen, where every single arcade machine could be found and the tickets that you won could be used as a currency more valuable than the money that your parents had exchanged for tokens. However, like a lot of childhood memories, going back to these buildings later in life as an adult shows us how much our childhood minds had filled in the blanks. And it's hard not to be disappointed when you notice how bad the pizza is, how overpriced everything is, and how there is a real rundown vibe to pretty much everything inside. But Security Breach captures the former, and it reignited those memories of impossibly large possibility spaces. Little details weren't lost on me. Pinhole lights being used to emulate stars in the ceiling, huge signs that points you into each massive themed room, and just this overall sense that at the end of every hallway and every turn, it could lead you to something more incredible than you had seen before. And then the second thing that the Pizzaplex offers up is the sense of wish fulfillment that every kid had while visiting a theme park or a place like this. The idea of having full run of the place. It's an intoxicating desire. The freedom to skip lines and to really drink in the atmosphere. And then thirdly, the creepiness that would come with being in a place like this alone when everybody else was actually gone. The creeping contrast of spaces that were meant to be filled with laughter and the cacophony of arcade machines suddenly replaced with an otherworldly quiet. A space meant for joy and commerce turned into a real liminal space. I adore the Pizzaplex from both an aesthetic and level design standpoint. It feels fresh and familiar and alien all at the same time, and I haven't felt this impressed with a game space probably since the original BioShock. And then equally freaky is how this game mirrors how the last 2 years have turned some of these real-life destinations into wastelands themselves. Places like John's Incredible Pizza or Chuck E. Cheese have been shutting down and leaving town all because of the absence of patrons. And it's not just with these childhood destinations that we're seeing this, as we're seeing it with the malls that are dying all over our country's suburbs as Amazon had a record year. These things really tie together the concepts of liminal space and capitalist realism that were at the core of what Fisher wrote in so much length about. But under the surface of how this game elicits the contradictory theme of liminal space, the familiar and nostalgic suddenly turning foreign and creepy, is the interplay of how the framework and themes of this game play into the concept of hauntology. Five Nights at Freddy's has been going on for a long time, actually the better part of a decade now. What originally started off as a brilliant deconstruction of the horror genre, mostly due to limitations, has now become almost a parody of how horror franchises have been treated in Hollywood. A clever idea becoming more and more diluted with yearly sequels, soft reboots, more and more convoluted and contrived plot lines, all the while turning into a merchandising juggernaut. And now we're in the second game since this franchise's soft reboot. 2020's Scream did something similar to this, and coined a clever and slightly nightmarish term of the requel.
Oh my god, he's making a requel!
And from a plot standpoint, that is exactly where we are with FNAF. The requel being a sequel, but a reboot simultaneously in effort to capture a new audience. In so many ways, the original story of Five Nights at Freddy's ended back in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator from 2017.
Although for one of you, the darkest pit of hell has opened to swallow you whole. So don't keep the devil waiting, friend.
And then there was an epilogue of sorts in 2018's Ultimate Custom Night. But since then, the series has been cracked wide open again for a second wind with these now two Steel Wool Studios games. And now, so much of what felt final about the original games is being rehashed and reimagined for what is presumably a new audience. In keeping with Scream's requel terminology, this is very much akin to what happened in Force Awakens' Starkiller Base. FNAF is now in a time loop. The new era takes place in a universe where the events of the original games may or may not have occurred as they did in the original chronology.
While it's true that some stories associated with our name were loosely based on actual events, the majority of them were total fabrications from the mind of a complete lunatic. Lawsuits pending.
But certainly the games that we have played up until Steel Wool took over the reins for this series exist in the universe for these new titles. So we are now on this weird blank slate that could be used to do any number of new things, but there is this certain tether to what came before it, so there's always limitations on what can be done without upsetting the fans that have been with the series since the beginning. Like Star Wars or Scream, FNAF is now in this weird place where it has to play to a few distinct fan bases in concert. The kids from 2014 who are now young adults, the kids coming up with this new wave of animatronic horror, and the weird adults that have been paying attention to what has been happening in the horror space ever since the original FNAF started. FNAF in a lot of ways is responsible for the recent wave of horror games like Bendy and the Ink Machine or Poppy's Playtime, but its reach has been felt on an industry-wide level. So even if the content that's here isn't for you, it's hard to ignore the impact and the influence. But where Scream's identity has always been metafiction and poking fun at trends, these other franchises, and in some ways the modern blockbusters at large, don't always get to escape the tethers of their past. A look back at the last 2 decades of summer blockbusters will tell you everything that you need to know about the current state of the entertainment industry. But I'm going to give this year's blockbuster Top Gun Maverick a pass because the movie looked cool as shit. The past chokehold on Five Nights at Freddy's is no different, and the game is aware of this. But really what made me start to feel dread about this game and its concept of hauntology was the same space that drew me into it initially, and that's the Pizzaplex. I loved the Pizzaplex, but looking at its 80s aesthetic, I had this eureka moment. With Five Nights at Freddy's always targeting kids, the same age group that probably would have read books like Goosebumps when I was growing up, a group I was happily a part of, I have to assume that the average kid playing this game is at least 2 decades removed from the cultural impact of its setting. And it just kind of made me sad. With the pandemic closing down so many of the remaining spaces that mirror the Pizzaplex in the real world, there's a whole generation growing up that takes in things like this or Stranger Things that looks back to an era that it has no connection to. And so what we are left with is this real cultural homunculus. Slender era gameplay trapped in a Stranger Things facsimile of an era that the audience never experienced yet has been taught to fetishize by reappropriating long abandoned ideas that have been repackaged in a way to be novel in an attempt to make money. I know I'm kind of repeating myself at this point, but this is being done as a way to illustrate the cycle that we've found ourselves in. I've made it this far and I haven't talked about the actual game of Security Breach at all in this video, and it's for a good reason. The gameplay is just shit. It plays like a mod of Alien Isolation, which in and of itself was a weird repurposing of late 70s horror in, coincidentally, the same year that the original Five Nights at Freddy's came out. And Alien Isolation was an idea born out of 2012's Slender, the 8 Pages' gameplay. So we now have this game where you get to explore a truly unique environment, which is stripped of its uniqueness by its tether to an aesthetic that has been so well tread that it is a fine powder now, but you don't really truly get to explore it, because the halls of the Pizzaplex are crawling with this series' animatronics, and they are all equipped with cheaper AI than a game that came out a decade earlier. Seriously, whether it's Chica or Monty, or whichever of these new robots has been made to sell more merchandise in the near decade since these animatronics first changed the gaming landscapes that's chasing you, none of these enemies play by the rules. There is no real feedback when you're in their line of sight, there is no real rhyme or reason as to where these enemies are going to spawn from, and even mechanics like hiding don't seem to have consistent results for getting away. And that is all if they don't just flagrantly teleport to your location, which is something that happened in my playthrough regularly. And what is worse are these games' scripted encounters. At their core, these should be the coolest and most visually interesting sections of the game. Whether it be playing a round of Phaser Blast while being chased through the arena, or what would be my favorite, navigating a tube maze in the daycare while being chased by the new sun-moon attendant. Seriously, this scene is tense and creepy, in no small part because of how the attendant shifts his personalities from being an overbearing caretaker to a strict enforcer.
Stay up all night! There is only one rule! Keep the lights on. No! No! Why would you do that? Lights on! Lights on! I warned you! I warned you!
Naughty boy. It's past your bedtime. You must be punished.
Is a classic split personality brought on by the darkness in the room, and setting it inside of a tube maze is awesome. There was always something so strange about those tubes growing up. They were fun play places for sure, but you never knew when you were going to run into another kid and get jammed into the interior. There was a Lord of the Flies quality in those spaces, kids clamoring over each other or even breaking into small fits of violence, all while stuck in this claustrophobic hellscape. So the idea of sending a shape-shifting demon behind you in these tubes was a great realization of the space that this game takes place in. But because of the teleporting AI, the maze structure of the level, and the fact that the attendant gains speed as you trigger generators in hope of stopping his aggression, the whole encounter turned into an exercise of trial and error. And it just killed the tension of what was otherwise an amazingly executed setup. Seriously, this character is creepy on so many levels, the environment is perfect, and it's just wasted. The whole game is like that. And for whatever reason, even though we live in 2022 now, the game decided to implement manual save spots, which virtually guarantee that you will have to play some sections over and over again while you try to figure out what the game expects of you. And what the game expects of you is seldom very clear. Sure, there is always an objective that you can check in on, but navigating the Pizzaplex is not always the easiest thing to do. The map isn't the greatest, especially considering how bad the map is. The place is large, and there are all sorts of maintenance tunnels and back rooms to get lost in, so trying to navigate the space with teleporting monsters that send you back to the last manual save upon capture, yeah, let's just say I closed this game multiple times out of frustration. And that is really the worst part of the game, really, is the frustration, because there are some really cool ideas here at play. There are some amazing environments and some really demented and impressive set pieces, but most of the time you dare not explore any of this space, as you're always worried about being sent to your last manual save. So the actual game part of this experience goes to undermine the best parts of what could have otherwise been a fun and interesting experience. So much of this game could have been salvaged with a redesign of how the AI works and implementing regular checkpoints, but we are now 6 months removed from the initial release, so there really doesn't seem to be much hope of salvaging this game's true potential. It's a damn shame, but really when I consider this game's target audience, it hurts more. I'm in my 30s, so I remember going to video stores like Blockbuster or Hollywood Video and renting games whenever I can get my mom to take me. And because you really were limited by how many copies of a game were available, you sometimes just found yourself taking home games of real dubious quality. Back in the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo days, there were all sorts of licensed games that would capture a young kid's attention, and as a result I distinctly remember renting the adaptations of Home Alone and Batman Forever, and these games were especially dog shit. But even worse was the fact that I was a kid, so I didn't really know any better, and I took these games' unfair and poorly designed difficulty as a failure on my part, and that idea of getting lost or not knowing what to do as a failing of my own intellect. So my heart really does go out to any young ones trying to play this game and feeling like it's just too hard for them to finish. The game is not hard, it's broken, and it fucking sucks. And it really sucks because there's so much potential for this game. It sucks because there are these really cool moments and there's some beautiful art here, so it's only natural that players would like to see it. But like I said, taking your time to explore is just going to get you caught. And what makes it all the worst is the material conditions at play that compromise this game and so many other countless pieces of art over the decades. And that's just capitalism. At its core, the concept of hauntology is accelerated by the profit motive, and it creates this sense of mourning. Mourning of a past that we didn't get to experience because it has been put on this pedestal as it's been repackaged, and the mourning of a future that we didn't get to see because we were too busy rebranding the successes of yesteryear in an attempt to squeeze more blood from the stone. I want to live in a world where cool art rises to the top. A world where the clearly talented artists and programmers at Steel Wool don't have their project's development truncated in order to meet a deadline that destroys the creative and special parts of their work. I want to live in a world where new ideas are funded and where we don't have corporations just endlessly repurposing the same ideas over and over again. I want out of this cycle. And really the only thing that we can do as consumers is vote with our dollar. But when the biggest show in town and the most funded spectacles are created in this environment of cultural malaise, it is hard to see a way out, as people understandably still flock to experiences like this one or the 18th Marvel property released this year. I'm no better than these people. I paid for this game. I rewarded this bullshit. I traded my time to do labor so that I could be burned by buying this game. I went and saw Scream and Top Gun Maverick, and I even convinced myself that Scream's continued deconstruction of pop culture was worth contributing to a studio that keeps us in this cycle. I convinced myself that Maverick's spectacle and world-class cinematography were worth perpetuating this cultural degradation, and in some ways they were. But this is mostly because they were the biggest shows in town. But that means less and less when so many things end up in the same shape that Security Breach did. Fortunately, I have the resources to pay for a game like Security Breach and only feel slightly fleeced. But going forward, I want to go ahead and check out little titles that interest me more on a deeper level than an interesting coat of paint. Right now I'm looking forward to playing things like Blue 12 Studios' Stray, Neon White from Angel Matrix, going back and checking out Spiritfarer out of Thunder Lotus, and Umurangi Generation from Origame Digital. There is no shortage of cool and interesting shit out there. And I'll be damned if I spend the rest of my time on this earth paying and giving time to studios that don't want to be part of making rad things. So next time you find yourself with a few extra bucks for entertainment, take a couple minutes to think. Is what I'm about to spend my money on moving the culture or the art form in the direction that I want to be a part of? If you watched this video, if you made it this far, thank you for your time, really. Time is the most important resource that we have, and I truly appreciate you spending some of it with me as I've rambled about things in an only slightly coherent manner, especially considering the fact that it was about some not so happy topics. You are beautiful, and have a good day. Until next time.